Evening everyone. What we have in front of us is a alternator that's going to go into an Isuzu Bighorn, Jackaroo, Monterey, Trooper and so on. This is a 90 amp alternator and it's used in the engine, which is a 4JX1. You'll notice it doesn't have a vacuum pump on the back because the 4JX1 Isuzu engines have the vacuum pump mounted directly on the front of the engine, and that is directly cog driven. So what we'll do is we're going to tear this down, have a look at it, because it's a brand new part that I've just got in and I want to see how good it is. What are the bearings like? If you're wondering who the supplier is, Gen X, and there's a website down here you can go and have a look at. This will probably kick you through to auto parts online, an Australian website. A lot of reasonably priced parts, and freight is very cheap, so this is hopefully going to check out to be a pretty good aftermarket alternator, and it's a lot bigger than the one I've got. The current one I've got is a 70 amp and this is a 90, and the only difference is the body through here where all the windings are. The black bit is about 20 millimeters wider than the 70 amp one, but the distance between all the mounting points is exactly the same. So hopefully it'll fit in and we'll see how we go. But I'll do a separate video on that. But for tonight we're going to tear this down, have a look in it, and see what a new one looks like, because I've only ever pulled apart scungy old ones that are end of life, like this one. This is a 70 amp. It is buggered. It's got bits missing out of it. Pulley's broken off the front. It's got a burnt bridge rectifier diode in the back, so it's end of life. So I thought I'll upgrade to the bigger unit. Now the difference between these two units is this plug in the back here is of a different style than the new one, which looks like that. So I'm going to have to get a new plug for it and swap it out, and possibly longer belts, and maybe modify the mounting bracket that goes off the top here. Not sure yet, but anyway, enough dribble drabble. Let's get on with it and pull it apart and have a look what's inside. So first things first, 24mm nut on the front. You want to rattle gun that off. So this come off fairly easy, standard nut, spring washer. Another thing I forgot to mention, the difference between the 90 and the 70 amp alternator is this pulley size, but I don't think it matters. Okay, so I'll take that off, and the next thing I'm going to do is take out these 4 bolts here which hold the cage together. Part of the reason I want to tear this down is also to go through and basically copper coat or anti-seize coat all the nuts and bolts, because I do four-wheel driving. 4 bolts are released that hold all the front to the back. So what I want to see is this. That came off very easy. So we've got a bearing in the front here, and what I want to do is I want to see what the brand is, because if it's a cheap one it probably won't last very long in the mud. Also, the difference between the 70 and the 90 amp alternator is this is held in with this plate holding into the cage. So I want to, when we put this back together, put anti-seize in here so I can actually get it off the shaft, which will make it easier later on in about 6 to 12 months when I have to pull it apart again, because it's rooted with all the mud. What have we got in here? Look at that, all that nice shiny new copper. Isn't that neat? Smooth. And it's the nicest it'll ever be right now, which is quite good for a teardown. Now they have this little spacer in here which sits between the bearing. So now what we'll do is we'll draw out the centre here. Now in the front of this guy, and this is what I was interested in, is the main bearing. Now we've got a no-name brand of bearing in here, which is probably fine. I might replace these with good quality bearings. Now, holding that bearing in the front of this housing, which the bearing sits in there, they have a cap, and the 3 bolts that hold that were Loctited as well, so I just hit those with a little bit of heat and they come straight out. Now for the tricky bit, which I always struggle with, and that's getting the core out of the housing, and that's because there is a bearing in the back which gets held up in the back here, and it makes it quite tricky to pull out, but there's probably better ways of doing this. But I've just got 2 blocks of wood either side. What you do is you rest the edge of this housing on the edge of the block, trying to be very careful of your windings. Rest the other metal edge onto the block about there, and then you use your pulley puller or slide hammer very gently off an old cog, off an old pulley. See, now I remember that pulley got broken doing this previously on my 70 amp alternator, and use a slide hammer and just slowly, gently tap it out of the middle, and that's it. So I'll throw this up on the bench and we'll show you what we've got in here. So first we'll take off our old crappy pulley, which is off our old 70 amp alternator. Throw that down there and we'll have a look on the back of here. So this is where all the business happens. So this bearing here sits in the housing down the very bottom, and when you pull it out, you got to pull it past these 2 carbon brushes. Now those carbon brushes run on these slip rings, and they create a field in here which allows or energizes and allows this section to create the charging current that charges your battery. So it's very simple. These slip rings can wear a little bit. This bearing on the back here has, see these 2 little black surfaces here? They're like slightly rough areas which actually give it a bit of bite in the housing where the bearing runs. These bearings never really wear out. They don't have much force on them, they just glide away. You can pull these off, replace them, repack them with grease. Often when you repack them, you've got to flip the seal out, use like a little pin under here, and then get the very fine screwdriver and flip the seal out. But these ones are about $30 each, and they're quite hard to get, I think. Whereas the big bearing, which I've lost, here we go, these are about $7, very cheap, and these are the ones that go, which sit in the front of your housing in here. There's a bit of a trick when you go to reassemble these, because you go, well, how the hell do you get that in there with those brushes in the way? Well, you see how there's 2 little holes, or a little hole in there, and if I pull down the one behind, have a look at the one behind it, you'll notice there's a hole there as well. Well, in the back, you'll see there's another hole here. No coincidence, and there's one here. Well, what happens is when you go to reassemble it, you can get yourself like a drill here, which should fit through the centre of those holes. That one's too big, we'll have to get a smaller one. Right, we've found ourselves a small drill. Now this drill is, we're going to use this as a pin. You could use a little bit of wire, but I find the wire can be a bit bendy sometimes, which is not what you want. So you'll notice that drops down through there, which is perfect. So what you can do is you need to compress these back into the housing, roll this over and run this drill through the back so it drops through the first hole, which holds the back carbon brush down in there, and then if you hold this one down and push this in a little bit further, you're now holding down both carbon brushes, which allows you to reassemble this when you go to put it back together. It should just drop straight back in there. Now when you're 4-wheel driving, a couple of things go wrong. I might have mentioned this before or not, but we'll go over it again. Front bearing in here is often the first thing to go because it gets dirt and rubbish in it. That bearing can collapse and will cause your alternator to stall, and then your belts will run on the pulley. The pulley won't be turning and you'll burn your belts off. I've had that happen a few times. Generally you'll hear it or smell the belts squealing or burning. Second thing that happens is, second most common thing is, you'll get mud in behind the springs where these carbon brushes are, and what they'll do is they'll sit down like this, and the springs are under compression. Is that right? They're being compressed, so they want to push it up, but the mud holds these down and you lose contact on your slip rings, and then your little red charge light comes on in the car and you go, what's wrong with my alternator? Well, these carbon brushes are either worn and are no longer pushing on here. You can replace these, or mud has got in here and is holding them down. So you can, with the engine running, get out and give the side of the case a bit of a tap or a belt with a tyre iron or something, and often that'll just free them up enough to come up and give you a wee bit of charge to get you out of the track. But generally you need to strip it down and clean it all out. For observation, the difference between this alternator, the 90, and the 70, which I've got down on the floor in there, is to often keep the mud out. They have a sealing gasket in between here which keeps the mud out from getting in the brushes here. Now, the sealing ring would look something like this and is located in the back in here. And then you have a little bit of a tortuous path. See, this area here runs over the front of this. So when you peer down through the side, you can just see the copper on the slip ring in there. So I know with this alternator it could suffer more from mud damage than my old 70 down here on the floor. Because in the back of these, if I can get this off, so in the back of these there are a couple slightly better advantages, if there's such a term. There's quite a deep groove in here which actually runs over the front of this edge here, which has a lip which comes up, which creates a fairly more difficult path for mud to get in there. And in the back of here, between the bearing, the housing and all the plastic assembly, they have this seal. The new one does not have that, but as you can see they are very, very similar in design. It's just that the 90 has a bigger diameter than the 70, but everything is virtually the same. When I mean 70 and 90, I'm talking amps. Alright, we'll release all these nuts off the back here, and we'll actually pull this assembly out and we'll have a look at the diodes in the back for the power rectification, and we'll open this guy up and have a look at the buggered diodes and that, which one has blown up. So first we'll pull apart this old one and we'll have a look in here. So the bits in here, so this is a 70 amp one, this is the regulator, and then you have, these are the main, this is the plug that goes out. One is charge and the other one is for your dash light to tell you you've got a problem. Now these are the little brushes I was talking about. These are what can get a bit muddy and hang up. And this is the seal, the rubber seal, which would actually sit in the back here and press up against the housing here. And so that would keep a significant amount of mud out of your carbon brushes. Now we've got a series of diodes here. How many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is blown up. It's quite black, charred, burnt out. It just didn't charge very well. It was a bit lazy because effectively I think if you lose one of your diodes you'll charge at about half the rating of it. So it very soon becomes a 35 amp alternator, if that, and you start to get a flat battery. But anyway, that's that one. and we'll have a look at our new jobby. So we'll pull this apart and have a look in there now. So I've gone and released the main nut off the charge. This one goes to the battery, big heavy cable. Then we've got, what have we got? 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little nuts to take off the back of there. And this should come out as an assembly, including the winding here. There we go, just like that. So you can see I've still got the little drill in there holding those carbon brushes in place. So, same as our 70, so I'm holding onto the 90. Have a look at the 70 amp alternator. Very similar. The bridge rectifier or diode block in there. Same amount of diodes. These ones are just spread further apart. Plugs different on the side. And the interesting thing is, so these are your carbon brushes which I was talking about. You can replace these with replacement carbon brushes when they wear out, and you desolder them off here and here. So you need to undo, where is it? I'm not sure. You undo some screws and slide out your regulator and desolder. You could probably just cut the bit of plastic off there and just do it in place. It would be easier than trying to desolder or pull all this stuff apart. So there you have it. And you can see where the wires come out of your windings here. These are main power producing windings that charge your battery. You can see they come through here and are soldered onto diodes in the diode block here. So a couple of things can happen. You can blow up a diode block, you can replace these, or you can kill your regulator, power regulator. So this sets your charge voltage and stops you overcharging your car battery or truck or four-wheel drive or whatever it is in. And that guy there is your main power feed off to charge your battery. So that's it really. What we'll do is we'll put it back together. Okay, time to reassemble this sucker. It's always quicker putting things back together than pulling them apart, especially when you don't know what you're doing. So, I was using a drill before, but we've got a piece of wire which will work in this alternator just as well as anything. Makes it a little bit easier. If you probably do this now, you could do it after you've got the cover on the back, but push those two in, line up your hole, and drop your piece of wire through until it just pokes through the front here. Done. And then housing, line it up, get the piece of wire through the hole first. I've left enough to make it a little bit easier. And that drops onto there. And we'll put all our nuts and bolts on here. Caution when you drop your main winding back into the back of the housing, just make sure on the main charge feed bolt there is the little insulator in the back here, and that sets the spacing between the diode pack and the case, because if you've got that missing you'll do up the bolt on here and you'll crank it to death. So then you've got a spacer on here. I've done up these guys in here, the 5 of those. Spacer, there's alignment for that, so get that into the little alignment. And then torque all these up, not too tight, just enough. So future proofing for reassembly, first thing you want to do is use some copper coat or something. And you want to put some anti-seize around the back inside surface where the back bearing sits. That'll help you get it out later, not too much because you don't want all of that grease and shit getting onto your slip rings. So I'll just wipe some around in there, so that's good. And I'll put just a tiny little bit on here, not much. just a very light smothering. Hardly even see it, because as you push it in, it'll tend to wipe towards the slip rings. The place you want anti-seize is on this shaft here, where your bearing runs and you've got your separator or spacer ring. At least that way you'll get it off in the future. Lots of anti-seize on there, including the thread. Wee bit in the wee spacer ring, slide that on. So I'll drop the core back in. Probably should just put the nut on the front, which helps give you a little bit of a grip. And I'm a bit out of shot here, never mind. So I'll drop that down in there nice and carefully. And let's come over here. So it's just started. I'm going to put that on a flat surface and give it a wee push. And that's now driven home. So just check. So that rubbing you can feel. It's the fact that you don't have your front bearing on there. I hope. So what we can do now is pull the pin out of the back, which will release the carbon brushes onto the slip ring. Next thing we want to do is copper coat inside the front bearing housing. So this is where the bearing sits closest to the pulley. This has the most weight on it. This isn't copper coat, this is a heavy duty anti-seize by Loctite LB8009. So it's not grease, it can go dry, but it still lubricates. Now I'm going to push that bearing back in on my press and then come back and put the cap on. So press the bearing in. It's just a wee word of warning after you've pressed your bearing in, just make sure it feels smooth to run. If it doesn't, if it feels a little bit lumpy, that's a brand new bearing. It means this is out of oval or something's gone wrong as you've pressed it in. You should never press it in on the inner, you should always press it in on the outside, because you'll damage the running surface of the bearing. So we'll throw this cap on here now. Screws, bearings in, caps on, screws are done up. Okay, final push, we'll drop our front cap on now. Should go on nice and easy. And we have to line that up. And we just fit which side they go through from there. Fit the final clamping screws together. That's my broken one, that's no good. Always hand start bolts. You'll get yourself into trouble if you cross thread something. Like that one's not starting for some reason. Oh, yep, that's away now. We'll go back and re-torque all these later. So there's two more to go. 1, 2. So we'll just tighten up those case clamps. And we're done. We've just got to put the front pulley on now. So we'll fit the final pulley now. This is the end of the road for this reassembly. Interesting enough, the 70 amp pulley is smaller, not by much, about 5mm all the way around. It does fit onto the 90 amp alternator, and it has the same offset with the belt and everything. So the biggest problem I have is I do a lot of idling with the lights on, and your battery does get run down if you've got a lot of lights on, accessories running at idle, doesn't charge enough. So I'll start with the big pulley and we'll see how that goes. If I'm still having problems, I'll revert back to a smaller pulley, and I'll use the one on my other alternator which is currently on the truck. But for the time being, I'll try this one. Now, there is a spring washer that goes in there, and then you've got your nut on the front of that, and I'll rattle that up with a rattle gun, and we're complete. Right, I should point out I've marked that so it takes it back to the same torque as I did it up to as when it was undone, if that makes sense. And also anti-seize on here, it'll make it easy to get off in the future. Okay, there you have it, a teardown of a brand new 90 amp alternator out of a Ford JX1, about to be put into service. Hopefully I haven't rooted it, I doubt it though, because they're pretty robust. And we've compared it against a 70 amp alternator. So in the next video I'm going to go through how we go about installing this and doing probably some subtle changes to go from a 70 to a 90. I've ordered a new plug because the plugs are different between the two, so I'll have to cut the loom and add that in, and maybe some belt changes. But anyway, have a look around for my next video where we upgrade the alternator. Thanks for watching. See ya.